As far as I'm concerned, as long as that same respect and recognition is not shown toward every one of our people in this country, it doesn't exist for me. And during the few moments that we have left, we want to have just an off-the-cuff chat between you and me. Us. We want to talk right down to earth in a language that everybody here can easily understand.
Welcome back to another episode of The Malcolm Effect. Joining me today is a dear friend and comrade and someone I'm super fortunate to be in community with. And today's discussion, given that we have just come out of an election and we're seeing all Trump's picks, and we know that the language around this election, as is the Democratic Party's talking point constantly about the looming fascism, or fascism is looming, and I do ask the question, when has this country not been fascist? But
Exactly.
helping me to unpack that is Dr. Corinna Mullin. How are you? And welcome for the first time to the Malcolm Effect.
Oh, thank you so much. It's a real honor and pleasure for me to be here. And I'm such a fan of your podcast. And also just want to say how much I appreciate you and all you've done, not just in terms of your amazing intellectual production and, this podcast, but also your incredible organizing work. And I just think so courageous and really helping to advance our struggle.
Thank you so much. That's an honor and privilege. And also just to shout out to you. Honestly, I've mentioned that the ISA, where I first met you, and so many other anti-imperialist scholars, and it's still in a time like this where so many academics have decided to not be on the front line, or have made their careers out of speaking about decolonization. It's good to know that we still have people in the academy and producing intellectual work in these places that are principled. So thank you and shout out to you. So we're talking about fascism today, right? And the political economy of fascism. I think, I want to stagger and tier the discussion. So perhaps we can go for maybe definition of terms, a basic understanding of certain things before we go into picking apart the specifics and applying the theory into our contemporary moment. So my first question is, how do you understand fascism?
Yeah, so I think that I'd like to start by just sort of challenging the standard liberal narratives about fascism, which are, obviously really dominant in our society, and which tend to frame fascism as the result of a few bad individuals who accumulate power, to serve their kind of evil agendas and achieve total domination of social, political, and economic systems. And this kind of analysis tends to focus on historical examples like Mussolini's Italy or Hitler's Nazi Germany, or contemporary ones like Trump in the US or Modi in India, Milei in Argentina, Le Pen in France, and among others. And so, they see fascism as a far right authoritarian political ideology and movement characterized by dictatorial power, forcible suppression of opposition, ethno-nationalism, a belief in supremacy of a particular race or ethnic group, and typically involves centralized control of the economy and society, rejection of democracy, and suppression of individual rights in favor of state power. So this rendering of fascism highlights fascism's rejection of liberal democracy, or, it emphasizes and claims that's what it's about, including elections, civil liberties, political pluralism. Yet, as and many Marxist scholars have pointed out, liberalism, really paves the way for fascism. And liberalism and fascism can be seen as two sides of the same capitalist coin. So, what I appreciate in your, when you reached out, you asked for a kind of political economy approach. And I think that's really crucial to grasp the nature, extent, and implications of current iterations of fascism. So, I wanted to bring a little bit of that in, if that's okay. And I was
absolutely. We can just segue straight into that, because that was going to be my next question anyway. Yeah, what is? I think as Marxist scholars, we constantly try to ground ourselves in the material, right? So when we think of like the materiality or the political economy of fascism, how do we begin to understand that? Or what does that approach sound like?
Right, exactly. Because, yeah, that definition that I sort of just shared, the liberal definition, is certainly not mine. And I'm sure not yours either. So, yeah, in terms of the political economy, it's interesting because I was just listening to a recent talk. I don't know if you heard it, by Gabriel Rockhill.
Yep.
Um, yeah, and I think it's called like Are Fascism and Liberalism Partners in Capitalist Crime? And it's I really, I urge others to listen too. It's great because he points out the major differences between the two forms of governance, fascism and liberalism. Is that liberalism, he says, is a hegemonic or soft mode of capitalist governance, where fascism is the repressive or authoritarian response when liberalism fails to maintain order. And yeah, and I would just sort of add, when liberalism, fails to sort of stabilize capital accumulation. And I'll talk about that a little bit more in the face of, capitalist crisis. But both systems are driven by capitalist imperatives to control the working class, and maintain profit. He points to an interesting example in U.S. history where fascist forces were prominent, including in 1934, when a fascist coup plot was uncovered in the U.S. and it involved powerful corporate elites like DuPont and Rockefellers who were seeking to overthrow FDR's government and replace it with a fascist dictatorship. That was a really interesting moment in history that, I myself hadn't heard about. So this American fascist movement, he said, was linked to, military industrial complex interests, which the current, obviously, iteration is as well. So from a Marxist perspective, fascism, he says, is, or fascism, we can understand is viewed as integral to capitalism, not an aberration, and it functions as a tool to protect capitalist interests during times of crisis. So going back to that period, the Great Depression. And what he advocates is a dialectical approach to understanding fascism. And he looks at three levels, which I think are really helpful for our conversation. One is the conjunctural level. So fascism's rise in specific historical contexts, and for the purposes of our conversation, think about it in terms of crisis of capitalism. The structural level, so the global systemic connection between capitalism and fascism, visible in capitalist countries worldwide. And then the systemic level, so thinking about a historical materialist approach linking fascism to broader colonial and capitalist dynamics. And, he emphasizes this dialectical approach to think about fascism as something that's not, a phenomenon that's not fixed, but manifests in varied forms depending on historical, cultural, and economic context. So an analysis that doesn't consider the systems and structures that enable and perpetuate fascism, in my opinion, will invariably lead, as it does, to political confusion and, problematic analysis. Like, we tend to see these false comparisons made between communism and and totalitarianism or fascism, Hitler and Stalin. People who have read Domenico Losordo are familiar with this argument. And, he talked about, he's obviously the Italian philosopher and militant. He published extensively on Marxism, capitalism, Western philosophy, and the history of the communist movement. And he famously critiqued the false comparison that liberals often make between fascism and communism by arguing that it distorts the historical and ideological realities, obviously, of both systems, obscuring the distinct ideological roots and goals of each, preserving capitalist and colonial hierarchy by justifying violent repression, racial domination, and nationalism in the former, in fascism, under fascism. Whereas under communism, communist revolutionary ideology aims to overthrow those systems and abolish class, racial, and colonial oppression. So there's obviously no comparison to be made, but because liberals don't have that structural and systemic and conjunctural analysis, they tend to fall prey to this sort of political confusion. And that also happens like in terms of trying to equate political violence under, of communist states who have to use a level of violence to defend their revolutions versus the violence of imperialism and capitalism, which, seeks to overturn those revolutions. And I think about the false equivalence that's often made in contemporary discourses between, say, the genocidal violence of Zionist imperialism versus, the violence of the Palestinian, liberation struggle and regional resistance, those false equivalences. And we see that often in the liberal discourses on fascism. So I also, another important point that I think a Marxist, Leninist, or, a global South, let's say a third world, global South Marxist, Leninist analysis of fascism will point out is the legacies of slavery and colonialism as well. So the original, as you said, I think you started out by saying this country has always been fascist, and, the original systemic expression of fascism and the already existing forms of fascism in a settler colonial white supremacist capitalist imperialist state like this one. And Aimé Césaire, of course, in his discourse on colonialism made that connection. Yeah, he critiqued the West's narrow focus on the Nazi genocide as, the only example of fascism, pointing out the contradictions in a Western-dominated international legal system that refused to trace a genealogy of, fascist genocide back to colonialism and the transatlantic slave trade. And he argued that, he referred to the genocide as the boomerang effect, right, of colonization. And that means that, the brutal system of oppression imposed on colonized people eventually came to affect the colonizers themselves. And, so yeah, I think that making these kinds of important connections, both to the history, rooting our analysis of fascism in these longer, longue durée, and these sort of histories of settler colonialism, of capitalist accumulation, and, the sort of violence that's required to enable and perpetuate it, and imperialism, the sort of external expression of that is really crucial in order to avoid falling into the kind of political confusion that is, that is prevalent in liberal circles.
Absolutely. No, thank you so much for that. Such a elaborate and detailed response. Picking up on something you said, without a structural analysis of fascism or taking a dialectical approach to understanding fascism and the way it expresses itself at different moments, I remember distinctly during my own radicalization, the comparisons of like, okay, you get Hitler, Stalin, and Mao, as if to say they were all the same, as if to say they're all the same, they're all doing the same thing, right? And I remember that being like a sticking point and something I had to like overcome and understand and contextualize. And you mentioned Dominic Losodo, Critique of a Black Legend. Stalin is a great way to start, a great book. And there's many other books as well, which I can put in the episode description to elaborate this point. Okay, so you mentioned this point of crisis. And I think, anyone who's a Marxist on the left and studies capitalism, you're always going to come up with, okay, crisis, something that happens with crisis and capital. Capitalism as a system of development, a system that is crisis prone, often has to export its crisis, right? So I guess my question is that, like, so what is this connection? If you can break it down, this connection between like capitalist accumulation, or capitalist crisis, and fascism as well.
Yeah, sure. I'll try. Yeah, so I think now I wanted to go back to the argument. I think that Raquel was making. Maybe this will help us sort of address this question about thinking about liberalism and fascism as the same sides of two sides of the same coin. So, we know that liberalism, which is part of the ideological superstructure for the capitalist mode of production, paves the way for fascism in that it structurally cannot adequately address the contradictions that emerge from the crisis of capitalist imperialism. So crises of accumulation, for example, that happen periodically in the capitalist system. And liberalism just is structurally is incapable of addressing that because it's part of that system. It's part of that mode of production. It is, it's the ideological superstructure. So it can't answer that question. And, the sort of social issues that emerge from that crisis in terms of, higher levels of inflation, higher levels of unemployment, growing levels of inequality, the structural violence of capitalism that the working class, and in particular Black and Brown, Indigenous, other racialized communities bear the brunt of during times of crisis, because of course the ruling class, it protects itself and deflects onto the working class burden of that crisis. So when that happens, they can't offer a satisfactory response. And so they open up a space for fascist discourses that claim to be able to offer an adequate response. They at least, maybe acknowledge the problem, whereas the liberals can't even acknowledge it. But of course, the response that they offer is so, is so off base, is so ridiculous, and, equally can't respond to the crisis in a way that meets, that is adequate for the working class, and in particular for the most oppressed and marginalized in society. So because they deflect, right? They'll deflect their analysis from the true causes of inequality, poverty, exploitation, and oppression, which we know are colonialism, capitalism, and imperialism, and white supremacy. And instead, they blame migrants, racialized communities, other internal others, including, political internal others. So, Rockhill discusses how, and I know we're going to talk a little bit more later about the elections themselves, but just, here he talks about how the Biden administration presenting as a good cop image in contrast to Trump's bad cop during his time in office, that Biden, despite his presenting a good cop, he didn't, he, like other liberals, did nothing really to crack down on either the systemic causes of fascism or the fascist forces in this country, like the Oath Keepers or the Proud Boys. So, revealing the liberal complicity of fascism. And, ultimately we know, even if the Democratic establishment have anxieties about losing some bourgeois rights, and also, there's the fear, the revenge factor maybe of having Trump return to power, they would 100% prefer to take the risk and have someone like Trump in power than a socialist or even a social democrat like Bernie Sanders. We remember, what the Democratic Party leadership did with Bernie Sanders in 2016, where they sabotaged his campaign, and even, at the expense of alienating their own base and losing the elections, allowing Trump to win. Even Senator Elizabeth Warren said, in a CNN interview that the DNC rigged the race on behalf of Clinton. So yeah, fascism is a bipartisan affair, and both parties empower fascism on different fronts. Most mainstream approaches leave out the kind of history of how, liberal democracies have collaborated with fascist movements, the role of capitalist elites in funding fascists, thinking about like the role of Ford, General Motors, and Standard Oil of New Jersey, DuPont, who were heavily involved, for example, in investing in German weapons production in the interwar period. And in fact, American investment in Germany sharply increased after Hitler came to power. And that's, that kind of complicity of big capital in, as a way to accumulate, the point being that they invested because they needed to make up for losses that due to the crisis of capitalism during that period. So they had no problem making up those losses in investing in fascism, in the same way that today, the stock markets, the defense industry, several sectors of the economy are benefiting from the genocide, from imperialist warfare, in the proxy U.S. NATO proxy war in Ukraine, the multiple forms of hybrid warfare across the globe, as a way to make up for, that loss due to the crisis of capitalism. So, I think, and I want to speak more specifically to this crisis in a moment, but I just wanted to sort of point out how these histories are often, again, left out of our understanding of our analysis of fascism. And, and I don't think it's surprising because, of course, the the way in which fascism is taught in this country is very much linked to how invested our institutions are in settler colonialism and capitalism and white supremacy and anti-communism. And so that's the reason for all of these gaps in our knowledge. And that's why I think it's really important to read more broadly on the question of fascism, in particular to learn from revolutionaries and those guerrilla intellectuals who were committed to liberation. And most importantly, I think those with the most intimate experience of fascist repression by the state, including indigenous, Black and brown working class folks here on the front lines of resisting settler colonialism, white supremacy, and capitalist imperialism, and for those reasons have been targeted by the carceral system. And the scholar Orasami Burton, calls these comrades the tip of the spear revolutionary action, and that's where I think I find the most convincing explanations of fascism today, in particular as a response to the crisis of capitalism. So, yeah, I don't know if you want me. I wanted to sort of bring in a little bit about
that was necessary.
That.
Thank you. Yeah, that was necessary providing that greater context, actually. But yes, please do carry on in terms of like this link between like the crisis of capitalism and capitalist accumulation and fascism.
Yeah, so I know it's a little bit of a circuitous route, but I'm going to get there. And I wanted to tell me if you need me to speed up.
No, not at all. This is great. Thank you.
But so like I wanted to go a bit into the history in light of what I just said about the Black Panther Party, because I think really they had some of the sharpest analysis of fascism that we can find today and that we can learn from, and especially relevant and a lot of parallels with our current moment. So the scholar Robin Spencer has covered some of this history and showing how the Black Panther Party, for example, drew inspiration from Georgy Dimitrov's 1935 report on fascism that was delivered at the 7th World Congress of the Communist International in 1935, shaping the understanding of fascism as the rule of finance capital, embodied in banks, corporations, racist police, and demagogic politicians. So the Black Panther newspaper actually featured articles, and in an article Robin Spencer wrote in this, she has the cover of one of these papers that says, "Fascist pigs must withdraw their troops from our communities or face the wrath of the armed people." And, they really highlighting the Panthers' role in anti-fascist struggle. The Black Panther Party, in fact, were one of the key organizers of the 1969 United Front Against Fascism conference, in which drew 5,000 activists from groups like the Black Student Union, SDS, Young Lords, and their goal was to unite against fascism and establish a common revolutionary program that addressed the needs of oppressed people in a racist capitalist America. And they aimed for a multiracial coalition to challenge systemic oppression. So, and it provided really an avenue as well for white comrades in solidarity with Black liberation struggle. And since I think that's a really important moment in history to go back and learn from. And also, since Trump's elections, there has been a resurgence of interest in George Jackson's, of course, Blood in My Eye, in particular for his insights into the systemic nature of fascism. And for those who don't know, George Jackson was a Black revolutionary, a writer, member of the Black Panther Party, who died a martyr in 1971 at the hands of prison guards. And his writings on fascism, imperialism, and revolutionary struggle were deeply shaped by his commitment to Marxist-Leninist theory and the examples of anti-colonial struggles around the world. And his work within the Black Panther Party, especially his focus on prison organizing, drew parallels between prison abolition and revolutionary movements, underscoring the necessity of armed struggle and mass-based organizing in both urban and carceral contexts as part of the struggle against fascism. So I want to particularly discuss the connections he made between domestic and global manifestations of fascism, because I think this helps to understand also the crisis of capitalism, because of course we're talking about capital accumulation on a world scale. And in his text, Blood in My Eye, Jackson describes fascism as a higher form of capitalism that emerges to preserve the hegemony of Western monopoly capital during times of imperialist crisis by suppressing class struggle and revolutionary consciousness, relying heavily on the institutions of organized violence to maintain control. And I'm particularly interested here in Jackson's concept of international fascist counter-revolution as the response to core capitalist states, to the success of socialist and other anti-imperialist national liberation movements of the 50s and 60s. So you see, that's what the crisis was at that time that he was writing. The crisis was, you had countries who, these decolonial struggles, you had socialist revolutions, all of this national liberation, which was threatening polarized accumulation on a world scale. It was threatening to reverse or to stop the drain of wealth that characterized hundreds of years of capitalist imperialist domination of the globe by core capitalist states. And so the parallel today is, as the primary contradiction of the current conjuncture is also between a capitalist imperialist core in crisis and an emergent new world order being wrought by a global majority that seeks to complete that unfinished project of national liberation. So, that's the sort of core, that's the, crisis we're talking about here. And I think I find particularly resonant Jackson's words on the US-led international fascist counter-revolution. And I'd just like to quote him here, in which he wrote, "The history of this country in the last 50 years and more, the very nature of all its fundamental elements and its economic, social, political, and military mobilization distinguish it as the prototype of the international fascist counter-revolution. The US is the Korean problem, the Vietnamese problem, the problem in the Congo, Angola, Mozambique, the Middle East. It's the Greece and the British and Latin American guns that operate against the masses of common people." And he continued to argue that one of the most definite characteristics of fascism is its international quality. And that is something that really is missing, not only from liberal definitions and analyses of fascism, but even on the left often. I think that people tend not to think about fascism as a global project connected to stabilizing, polarized accumulation in the world system. So I did want to bring in another sort of thinker that could help us here, but I don't know if you want how you're feeling and if you want me to sort of continue.
Yeah, no, please do. This is a rich conversation, please.
Okay, excellent. Because a few years ago, I wrote a piece on another insurgent scholar, Danny Nambuderi, and who was, I'm not sure, if you're familiar with him, but he was, a Marxist-Leninist, Pan-Africanist, and anti-imperialist scholar and activist, who, played a very important role both in intellectual and political struggles for African liberation. And he wrote this excellent book called The Political Economy of Imperialism. And this book, essentially, in this book, he equally described fascism as a response to capitalist crisis. And he looked at how fascism emerges as a reactionary solution to the crisis faced by monopoly capitalism due to the falling rate of profit. And I want to quote him here too as well. He says, as Nambuderi puts it, fascism came in to assist monopoly capitalism by smashing all the bourgeois individual democratic rights and institutions in order to protect the bourgeoisie as a class against the possibilities of socialist revolution. So the rise of fascism in Germany and Italy after World War I was a key example. He thought of how fascist regimes were used to preserve the capitalist order during periods of deep crisis. And similar to Jackson, he looked at the global dimensions of fascism, considering its alignment as a political economic system with the logic of imperial violence and racialized exploitation under global capitalism. And when capitalism faces crises of accumulation, he argued, imperialism intensifies, with the imperialist core extracting cheap raw materials and labor from the global south to restore profitability. And as I was saying earlier, to stabilize that polarized accumulation on a world scale. And that, of course, leads to and requires heightened militarization. So in the imperial core, the US, EU, fascism strengthens the carceral state and relies on state violence to repress labor movements and maintain capitalist hegemony. Whereas in the periphery, it's imperialist backed, comprador governments who, on the one hand, who are supported to prevent national liberation or the rise of socialist revolutions with the support of imperialist powers like the US and imperialist, dominated institutions like NATO. Or if they are national liberation governments, if they are governments committed to, sovereignty, to challenging the polarized accumulation in the world system and stemming the wealth drain from global majority states, then, we see all kinds of hybrid warfare as an attempt to initiate regime change. And, we can talk about that later. So just to sort of conclude on this, though, I think that his insights, Nambuderi's insights into imperialist fascism, really underscore the symbiotic relationship between fascism and imperialism, where fascism serves to protect global capitalist structures in times of crisis.
Thank you so much for that. And I think why it's so important, right? Because several people have raised this. Prior to the election, Donald Trump was the reincarnation of Hitler, right? And then the Democrat, we have democracy is on the ballot, the liberals claim, right? And we have to stop the impending doom or the cliff jumping face first dive towards fascism, right? Yeah. And then now it's like, oh, Biden and Trump are seen shaking hands and we must ensure a smooth transition of power. So I'm like, which one is it? Like, which one is it? Is it that this is the reincarnation of Hitler and he's going to do irreparable damage to the country? Or is it that, we must ensure a smooth transition of power and the strength of our democracy? And the strength of our democracy is that we can ensure a smooth transition of power. So I'm always kind of like, okay, which one is it? Do people even hear themselves? And then do they even try to be consistent? Because from my perspective, they don't, right? When you see what happens. But I do want to address it because my understanding is very simple. This is just two faces of the ruling class. Right. And while their tactics may differ, the agenda and program is the same for the most part, as it comes to protecting capital. Right. So when I think of this election, though, I do want to address and just kind of like get your thoughts on the election. I know people have said, we're looking at Trump's election picks, right? Cabinet picks, Mike Huckabee. We're seeing Marco Rubio. We're seeing Tulsi Gabbard, right? People who are the neocon war hawks back into bringing them into government and giving them government positions. How are you understanding this election first? How did you understand this election first and foremost? And then what's your assessment in terms of as it pertains to like fascism with Trump's picks and he's probably going to get maybe another one or two Supreme Court justices as well. So do you think it's like, I don't know. I don't particularly advocate for electoral politics, except when it's used as a tactic but not a strategy. It's not the goal, and politics extends beyond every 4 years, right? Politics is what you do actually in between. But I do wonder, I do wonder what your thoughts are as it pertains to, because there is a lot of like fear amongst people given what Trump is rolling out in this moment.
Yeah, no, that's a great question. And yeah, I totally agree with you. We're certainly not going to get the kind of revolutionary change we need here through elections. But I will say this. Well, I will talk a little bit about Trump's picks, but before I get there, and some of the threatened policies too, which are really terrifying, to be honest, if they were to be carried out. I mean, deporting over 20 million people, bringing troops onto the streets to put down protests, things that are going to also impact, obviously, our context organizing in university spaces. But even before getting there, of course, we're already on that path. And that's what I think is so helpful about thinking about fascism as structural versus about individuals, because regardless of who won this election, this is the direction that the country is going in and needs to go in because of this capitalist crisis. Not needs to, because obviously there's an alternative, which is, revolution or socialism. But, this is the response, of course, of capital. And so, but I will say something about those picks in a minute. But I just want to say, again, we need to understand fascism as already existing in the U.S. And going back to George Jackson, what he said, understand the reality of our situation. Fascism is already here. People are already dying who could be saved. That generations more will die or live poor, butchered half lives if you fail to act. We know this country was built on genocide, and its political economy and institutions are designed to perpetuate both these slow and fast forms of genocide. As the 1951 Civil Rights Congress petition, the We Charge Genocide pointed out. And slow forms of genocide, fascist genocide, are the result of structural violence of capitalism and the its impact in producing and exploiting the vulnerabilities, in particular of racialized working class communities, Black, Indigenous, Latinx, and migrant communities, and especially undocumented workers. We saw that during COVID, how the state was happy to exploit the labor of vulnerable migrant workers, many of whom were considered essential workers, but at the same time, through vaccine apartheid, the lack of adequate public health services due to years of defunding under neoliberal austerity, failure to provide material support for families in need who were undocumented, and all of this contributed to, and the horrific situations, of course, in our prisons. All of this led to the death of so many vulnerable people because of prioritizing profit over human life. That's capitalism. And prisons, even outside of COVID, we know are also a site of slow genocide. So many folks incarcerated folks die prematurely due to horrible conditions in our carceral state. And we have, leading country in the world of with nearly 2 million people behind bars. And, again, it's highly class and, based and racialized as well in terms of who's impacted. So in terms of the fascist genocide, there are the hundreds of people killed each year by racist police in this country. And I believe in 2023, the numbers went up from being 600 to 700 in the prior years to 1,353 people who were killed by police. And that's the highest number, I think, since 2013. So in addition to structural fascism in the U.S., going back to the, Raquel's conjunctural analysis, we need to think about how the fascist elements of the state have been mobilized, in particular in this past year, in the state's counter-fascist, which is also a form of fascism, counterinsurgency against, going back to, the concept of tip of the spear, or those who are organizing really in resistance to capitalist imperialism. And that includes the targeting of the Uhuru 3, that was sham, the sham charges that were leveled against them for being so-called agents of Russia. And, those, some of the charges were dropped, but the sham conviction on conspiracy charge was, so the FARA Act, I think, charges were dropped, but the conspiracy charges held. And Black Alliance for Peace, excellent, amazing anti-imperialist organization, rightfully pointed out that amounted to them being essentially guilty of internationalism and the work of liberating African people. There was also the RICO and domestic terrorism charges against the Stop Cop City organizers. And previously, there have been domestic terrorism charges against land defenders. And now we know Sami Doon is the latest to be targeted by this McCarthyite witch hunt against anti-imperialists in this country. And it's been designated by the Office of Foreign Assets Control, OFAC, as a so-called sham charity that serves as an international fundraiser for the PFLP, which is a designated foreign terrorist organization. Now we have to, of course, ask ourselves why this country has that kind of a list in the first place, and who, why is it that the U.S. gets to decide who gets on these kinds of lists? The number one terrorist we know in the world is the U.S. and Israel, right? But this kind of list is used to repress liberation movements and struggles and anti-systemic states across the globe, and also to really break down any forms of sabotage, any forms of solidarity with these movements and states. So the OFAC listing of Sami Doon, I should say, was done in coordination with the government of Canada, which listed Sami Doon as a terrorist organization. And of course, all of this is designed to have a broad chilling effect on civil liberties, on freedom of expression, all those, nice liberal bourgeois rights that you'd think liberals would be up in arms about, because this is, how they understand fascism. But there's pretty much silence on all of these issues and it's really only sort of radical organizations and activists who are talking about these issues right now. And all of this, I think, and of course this resonates with, it echoes earlier forms of McCarthyism, when labels like anti-communist, un-American were used, weaponized to justify attacks on activists and dissidents, and to silence opposition to U.S. imperialism and capitalist exploitation. Today, it's, in place of communism, it's a terrorist label that's being used, and oftentimes in collaboration with anti-communist discourses as well. So, but maybe the most prominent facet, I would say, in this past year, at this current conjuncture of the fascist counterinsurgency in the U.S. has been, and you know about this more than most, the targeting of the student intifada.
Yep.
Right? I mean, and most visibly, the repression last spring of the Gaza Solidarity encampments. And, these encampments, not surprisingly, were seen as particularly dangerous during a moment of capitalist imperialist crisis, because students and academic workers were drawing connections in terms of the investments and contracts and institutional ties of their universities, between their universities and the settler colonial genocide in Palestine, making clear their function in facilitating capital accumulation. So the state has been particularly concerned, I think, by the intersectional analysis of this student intifada, connecting as it has connected the everyday fascism of the U.S. police and carceral state, designed to uphold white supremacy, settler colonialism, managed class relations, with the targeted fascism used in counterinsurgency efforts to undermine liberation struggles within Turtle Island. And, now that they've experienced that firsthand, they can understand how it's been used in other contexts. So a lot of connections are being made, and especially about, how fascism is targeting global liberation struggles, and anti-capitalist, anti-imperialist in ideological orientation. So I think we can conceptualize this movement, the student intifada, as, as Charlotte Cates, actually, who's from Samidoun, brilliant radical thinker and organizer of the prison rights organization, doing such important work, because of course prisoners are really many ways there and, everywhere where you have anti-colonial, anti-imperialist struggle are at the forefront of the struggles, because these are people who have, really put their lives on the line and risked everything for the cause. And that's why that organization, the work that they were doing was so important and why they were targeted. But she described all of that as the kind of popular cradle for the Palestinian national liberation struggle. So I think that's really important to point out that
Absolutely.
that's why it's targeted, right? Because it's more than now just talking about Palestinian rights or Palestinians as a humanitarian crisis, which is crucial and important, but thinking about Palestinians as agents, their own liberation, and what is the role of people in the belly of the beast in supporting them. So yes.
Absolutely.
Yeah, so that's why I think we witnessed the movement's violent repression, fascist repression, and it's ongoing. As you know, just last month, a group of pro-Palestine student organizers at UPenn, University of Pennsylvania, had their homes raided in the middle of the night by police. I mean, just crazy stuff, including, those scenes across the country of, basically what looked like military interventions onto the encampments. And, many students, academic workers have faced job suspension, job loss, disciplinary procedures. I don't need to tell you, firsthand, this repression and, bravely fighting back against it. And, and they're continuing universities. They're using also they are doing, both the sort of, the sort of fascist repression and then the kind of also sort of more subtle liberal forms of administrative repression and bringing in new disciplinary measures and guidelines that undermine academic freedom and First Amendment rights on campuses. So all this to say that the capitalist state, I think it demonstrates how scared they are, really, how desperate they are. And because it's fighting on multiple fronts now because of this crisis. And it's fighting externally and fighting internally. And that's why the turn towards fascism is almost a structural necessity to salvage capital accumulation. And the fact that they're overextended, of course, in my opinion, is it's good for our side. And, now in light of that, I don't want to undermine, the severity of the current moment too, and what, that things could always get worse. They can, we know historically, they have. And, even though I'm focused on structures and systems, I think it's important to think about who the individuals put in positions of power, who's chosen in order maybe to anticipate, to think through like what's in store, what comes next. So, I'll just say a couple of words about Trump's cabinet and key appointments, which I think it's everything we would expect, right? There's no surprises there. It's a neoconservative imperialist agenda, figures who are committed to that agenda, to aggressive, to militarism, anti-immigrant policies, racist, white supremacy policies, expanding the power of monopoly capital. So you've got Thomas Homan, who's appointed to lead Trump's mass deportation program, a former head of ICE, who pledged to execute the largest deportation operation in U.S. history, targeting up to 20 million people, as I mentioned earlier, and including a focus on sanctuary cities, where I live in New York, which is supposed to be a sanctuary city and often hasn't been, as well as, workplace raids. And we have to think, I don't know, I'd love to hear your thoughts too, because, we have to think about what does it mean to be a sanctuary city or a sanctuary institution if we're, which I think we need to do, transform our universities into sanctuary spaces. And that goes for our most vulnerable, undocumented students and workers, but also a political sanctuary. That means that, so we should say we will not allow ICE onto our campuses to deport people. And that includes, but we should also say if people start getting arrested or detained or whatever, harassed, suspended because of their political beliefs and organizing, then we should also shut things down. Like there needs to be a plan in place. There should have been a plan in place already because this stuff has been happening. And of course, we know, Obama deported more people than Trump. Obama was described as the
deporter in chief. Yep.
Exactly. So, none of this should be new, but I did just want to flag that. And then also we have, of course, Stephen Miller, Deputy Chief of Staff for Policy. He's notorious for his role in crafting Trump administration's brutal immigrant policies, including family separations, advocating for military intervention to hunt down undocumented immigrants. In foreign policy, of course, Marco Rubio's appointment as Secretary of State reflects, real hawkish, neoconservative position, particularly his anti-socialist, anti-communist, his hate for socialist and anti-systemic states like Venezuela, Cuba, Iran, and, as well as worrying, of course, is his hostility to the BDS movement, which, should be the floor and not the ceiling of our movement. But even, that we've seen increasing targets, that BDS has been increasingly targeted. So, and he's actively sought to criminalize BDS, so that's something especially for people organizing in university spaces to think about. And he also, of course, supports sanctions against Cuba and Venezuela. And that's all part of the hybrid warfare, imperialist fascist hybrid warfare that is designed to uphold racialized hierarchies in our world system and polarized accumulation and wealth drain from the global South. And, also to try to achieve regime change, which, fortunately for Cuba and Venezuela and Iran, that has never been successful. And in fact, has initiated something I'd like to talk about later, which is like the rise of, or has contributed to the acceleration of the rise of this multipolar world order that's moving away from, dollar hegemony and the SWIFT banking system that, the U.S. can control and dominate. So that's, more a continuity there too. And we see that with Michael Waltz, chosen as a national security advisor. He's particularly hawkish and imperialist on Iran and China. And he played a key role in the White House's discussions following the assassination of Iranian General Qasem Soleimani in 2020. So, we know where he stands. Kristi Noem, Secretary of Homeland Security, openly racist positions, as are, many of these people, about immigrants, supported Trump's Muslim ban, which he says he's going to expand. Mike Huckabee, appointed to ambassador to Israel, it's a Zionist entity, and he continues his long history of defending Zionist policies, including advocating for the annexation of the West Bank and denying the existence of Palestinians as a people. And of course, Elon Musk and Vivek Ramaswamy's roles in this newly proposed Department of Government Efficiency, which is basically a department of racist austerity, which reflects Trump's prioritization of deregulation and, empowering monopoly capital to the benefit of the ruling class. So continuity, as well as likely an acceleration in some areas, fascist imperialism, but also some potential unknowns. So
Thank you for that. No, absolutely. Thank you. I think continuity, characterizing as continuity with some potential unknowns, I think is an accurate account of what is going on. So I have final 2 points to make. One being, do you want to perhaps bring in how does Palestine fit into what we're seeing in this particular moment in US history in terms of like the capitalism crisis? And then finally, I know we have something to plug as well.
Yes.
So,
yeah, excellent. Yeah. So, for where does Palestine fit? It's, right in the center of it all, as, I'm sure, I'm not sure, but I'd love to hear your thoughts on this too. But I think that especially sort of we're going back thinking about this dialectical materialist approach to understanding fascism as a structural response to the current crisis of imperialist capitalism. It helps us to see that it's not about Trump as an individual, but why Trump, in a way, was the inevitable winner of this election, but also why even if Kamala Harris had won, we would be expecting this fascist turn in any case. And the reason for this is that the current conjuncture is marked by that primary contradiction I mentioned about, this crisis, in the face of capitalist crisis, and can only be solved, I think, in one of two ways, right? National liberation on a world scale or fascism on a world scale. So in other words, to bring it back to your question, Palestine has everything to do with this current conjuncture. As the survival of humanity and all life forms on this planet depends upon the success of the Palestinian liberation struggle in defeating the global forces of fascism engaged in this ongoing genocide. So Palestine, I think, is serving a similar role in this struggle today, against the forces of international fascism, which are desperately trying to suppress the emergence of this polycentric world order that is going to challenge polarized accumulation that already is. And this is why we're getting this kind of violent response. So I think about parallels with Algeria in that earlier era of decolonization. And in the words of Frantz Fanon, we can see Palestine as the hornet's nest in which Western imperialism has got itself stuck. And of course, it's not alone in this historic role. And we've got revolutionary movements and states across the global South, including the Palestinian National Liberation Movement struggle, but also, the Bolivarian Revolution, the Alliance of the Sahel States, which is a really interesting and important development, the Kenyan popular struggle against neocolonialism, struggles across the Caribbean, Latin America, Africa, Asia against neocolonialism and imperialism. And all of these are, as well as, the anti-systemic states, the emergence of BRICS, the expansion of BRICS, China's Belt and Road Initiative. All of these are handmaidens of the birth of this new world order. And just as fascism was defeated by the forces of the periphery in the 1940s, with tens of millions of Soviet and Chinese troops really who were on the front lines, and another thing we don't learn about in history here, dominant history, that they're the ones who defeated fascism.
Exactly.
And today it's similar. It's the wretched of the earth who are fighting back. They are at the forefront of fighting fascism. And I want to bring attention here to an extremely significant event, in my opinion, that took place earlier this month in Venezuela. The world, and I can provide you a link if you want to put it in the post, the World Anti-Fascist Parliamentary Forum, which brought together parliamentary delegations from across the global majority states who gathered, in the words of Delcy Rodriguez, the vice president of Venezuela, and this is her quote, to raise their voice against fascism in these difficult hours that humanity is living through, with fascism constituting, she said, one of the greatest threats that looms against the human species and against the entire planet. So the analysis of fascism that emerged from this conference is one that anyone on the anti-imperialist left in this country really needs to listen to, as it draws on the same anti-colonial, anti-imperialist analysis of George Jackson, of Lucerdo, of Césaire, many of the other revolutionary thinkers and movements that they have espoused. And most importantly, it draws connections between imperialism, capitalism, and Zionism. And I think that's really, really crucial as well. And so as Rodriguez said, we cannot talk about fascism without understanding that fascism, when it has expanded to weave its networks and occupy international spaces, is a response to a crisis of the capitalist model. And she went on to, and I quote, to say it must be said that Zionism is an ideological political concept, is a fascist movement that denies life, that does not care about the extermination of thousands of women and children, one that doesn't mind annihilating the future of a people. So in the tradition of anti-imperialist anti-fascism, she explained that Zionism is not limited to the Palestinian territory, but she called it part of a global project that is connected to defending capitalist imperialism in this moment of crisis. So, being in a leadership position of a country that has been on the receiving end of multiple dimensions of imperialist hybrid warfare and counterinsurgency, in which Israel has historically played a key role, she's really well placed to make these connections. And, and I just want to very briefly, if I can, to talk about Israel's role in that.
Yes, please.
Okay, because, our comrade scholars like, Max Eil and Alexander Avinya have really done important work on this and, documenting the role of Israel in U.S. imperialist counterinsurgency across Africa and Latin America, with weapon sales, training, covert military operations, which, essentially have been designed to provide plausible deniability. They're essentially operating as mercenaries for U.S. empire as the U.S. attempts to impose its will on the rest of the world, dominating land, resources, and labor while eliminating any forms of anti-systemic opposition. So the ongoing genocide in Gaza highlights the enduring function of this symbiotic relationship in sustaining regional instability, which in turn benefits both U.S. and Zionist capital accumulation on a global scale. And we know, and I mentioned some of them earlier, the kinds of hybrid warfare that I think we can describe in this context of as global fascism, going back to how Rodriguez framed it, but also going back to George Jackson's notion of international fascism and Nabuderi's as well, to think about this hybrid warfare in that framework. And, and I'm sure all your listeners are very familiar, with this hybrid warfare and how it blends military tactics with economic, political, and ideological tools, proxy wars, destabilization, fragmentation, balkanization through mercenaries. And I want to include here because, I get frustrated when people talk about, ISIS or so-called Islamist militias, in places like Syria, Iraq, Libya, Iran, Mozambique. Now ISIS apparently is operating, because they sort of take the what is essentially a kind of State Department narrative that these are indeed Islamist militias versus, what they are. They're death squads. They're death squads operating on behalf of this imperialist fascist project. And they do it in the form of these militias. They do it in form of gangs. If you look at Haiti or DRC, sometimes it's the form of cartels across Latin America. But, all of these are about destabilizing states, global majority states, and essentially in order to block, real national liberation from being achieved so that, again, polarized accumulation can continue on a world scale. And of course, that also includes sanctions, blockades, economic coercive measures, manipulation through imperialist dominated financial institutions, structural adjustment programs, all of that, informational and legal warfare, using labels like, terrorism or, state sponsor of terrorism, all of that to criminalize solidarity and basically make illegal just normal economic transactions that should be the sovereign prerogative of states. So all of this is about reintegrating these states into this world and movements, or defeating them or reintegrating them in, this system of polarized accumulation. And I'll just sort of end by saying that, this is all, I think, thinking about Ali Qadri's work and Matteo Capasso, they wrote a really great piece together, and thinking about imperialist violence as and genocide as, tools of accumulation through waste, and how, all of this is connected to stabilizing capital accumulation, and, the role of sort of brute violence in doing so, and similar to earlier versions of primitive accumulation. And, also, so therefore about removing people from the means of production, depeasantization, proletarianization, cheapening labor, cheapening the inputs for production so that surplus value extraction is higher, all of that as well. And yeah, but I want to sort of, we know, Israel plays a really important role in the global military industrial complex. It's highly integrated into the US's in particular military industrial complex, and especially like with high tech equipment and surveillance and drone technology. And that is, one of the leading drivers of the economy today. And, in 2024, I think the S&P 500 increased by close to 20%. And that, in large part was because of the various wars, whether it's Ukraine or, the NATO US led proxy war in Ukraine, or the genocide in Gaza, or its expansion regionally, but also, what I was talking about earlier in terms of the destabilization and intervention in Haiti, across the Americas, across Africa. There's a lot of expenditure there's a huge military buildup that's happening in the West in general. And that has led to, I think, something like, I had a percentage here about spending on a global scale, military spending reached an unprecedented 2.4 trillion, reflecting a 7% increase from the previous year. And that's the steepest rise since 2009. And of course, that's linked to, again, the Ukraine, Gaza, the military buildup in South China Sea, all of this. And the US, the fiscal 2025 national defense authorization calls for close to $1 trillion in US military spending. And this is all before Trump, right? So, I think that's really crucial and important. And just to also add that this is nothing new. Israel, Zionist settler colonial project has always been central to Western imperialism from its origins, first the British and now, the US, especially following 67. And that was, I have a quote here from Abdul Wahab Kayali in his 1977 text, Zionism, Imperialism, the Historic Origins, where he says, the Zionist state, he talks about the strategic role of the Zionist state in advancing imperialist interests in the region, not only in terms of control over natural resources and markets, but also on the level of ideological warfare, stifling Arab nationalism, Arab socialism, and anti-systemic developmentalist projects in the region. And he said the creation of the Zionist state in the region was seen as a strategic opportunity in the context of the growth and expansion of European imperialism. And of course, we remember Joe Biden's words, if there was not an Israel, we'd have to invent one. So I just, I just want to end by saying, I know I said I was going to end earlier, but
no, so good.
I want to end on a sort of positive note, which is that the point is that, as I said earlier, this is all a sign of desperation. The genocide is a sign of the desperation of the Zionist, imperialist, fascist world project. And those, the changes that they are trying to stop, whether it's national liberation in Palestine, and this is, and of course, this is not to minimize the horrific suffering of the Palestinian people, because, it's just beyond words. to see the death and destruction and happening and, in real time and televised. And this is what's driving this movement here, and how many people are willing to make sacrifices, because we cannot. What does this do to humanity? Going back to Césaire, to witness this, to accept this, to be complicit in this, But that being said, liberation is inevitable. It's going to happen.
Absolutely.
It's going to happen, and it's going to happen on a world scale. This is the beginning of the end of U.S. imperialism. And, and I think that is something that we have to remember during these most difficult moments. And I wanted to bring in here some words by a comrade, Wala Kaisia, who's, said in a recent article, she said, the waste-driven economy, referencing Ali Kadji's work, of the imperialists is put into crisis when the colonized rise up to declare the rightfulness of their intifada. And, we know that in the past, similar to these past struggles, third worldist liberation struggles from Haiti to Vietnam, Algeria to Cuba, that the Palestinian national liberation struggle is an anti-colonial world-making moment, using a concept that Adam Gatachew developed in her book, World Making After Empire. And, this movement, the Palestinian National Liberation Movement, asserts a global humanity that is unwilling to accept this, the centuries of exploitation, dispossession, oppression, and genocide as a mode of accumulation. And that gives me hope. And that gives me hope that, so many people here in the belly of the beast are coming to understand that, and to be aligned with, and, to be inspired by the resistance of the Palestinian people and other global South liberation struggles, and the resilience and the patience too. That's something we can learn from the resistance, the patience, because it is coming. We just need to, we need to stay the course, and it's going to be a difficult one in the coming months and years. But I'm ultimately hopeful.
Honestly, me too. I mean, it's tough at times when you see the death and destruction daily that emerges, but I think all of that just a hit dog always hollers, right? And
Yep.
for me, these things aren't indicative of a sign of strength or force, maybe, but rather a project that's coming to its end. And I think Zionism can never rehabilitate itself, and Zionism can never recover its image in the world. People have seen, the world, global majority has seen what Zionism is and what US imperialism is, and I don't think I see that ever coming back. So, absolutely, whilst death and destruction, and we remain in absolute solidarity with the steadfast resistance and the steadfastness of the Palestinians, we remind ourselves that victory is inevitable and a new world is absolutely on the horizon and within our lifetime. And I know finally we have a few things coming up. I know finally we have a few things coming up. So please tell the listeners what's happening.
Yes, well, there is going to be an important day of action coming up, November 21st, next week. And it's a call to action by a bunch of different organizations, including National SJP, Labor for Palestine, PYM, my organization, the organization that I organize with, CUNY for Palestine is also one of the organizations endorsing. It's basically, there are more than 25 now, this is earlier, organizations from 6 different countries who are joining this call for a university strike on November 21st against Zionist settler colonialism and genocide against the Palestinian people, the broadening imperialist assault on the region, and the states, companies, and institutions which facilitate, directly participate, and benefit from the war and destruction. We're calling on all students and academic workers, including lecturers, professors, and staff, to refuse to attend your classes or go to work, stop teaching, and bring these institutions to a grinding halt. And I hope I'll send you the link. I hope you can share that. And I know you are going to be coming to CUNY. We're so excited to host you for a talk as part of this, as doing a teach-in, and, we're super excited about that. And I hope that others, if they're listening to this program, can figure out how to get involved. There's this amazing toolkit. You can do anything from, a walkout, a sick out, to a strike. Of course, that's ideal. Pickets, protests, social media interventions. There's a whole list of things you can do. So I'll share that.
Thank you. And I'll post, please check out my social media. I'll also post Corinna's social media. You can check out. I highly recommend checking out her writings. And until next time, peace out.